Something just changed in the sky above us. And it changed faster than the forecasters themselves expected. Just a few days ago, the computer models were locked onto a stubborn, sweaty, unmoving pattern of late summer heat. And then overnight, those same models woke up and completely rewrote the story. A massive shift is now locking into place across the top half of the globe, a shift so enormous it stretches from the coast of Alaska all the way across to the frozen edge of Greenland, and it is about to reach down and grab the middle of this country by the collar. If you have spent the last few weeks tossing and turning through nights that never cool off, if you have been staring at your thermostat wondering when this heat finally lets go, then stick with me, because the answer is closer than you think, and it is arriving quicker than almost anyone predicted. Before we get into it, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next update, because I am going to walk you through exactly what is coming when it lands in your part of the country, and the one twist buried inside all of this that most people watching the news are going to completely miss. Let me start with the part that actually affects your day-to-day life, and then I will pull back the curtain and show you the machinery driving it, because understanding the how makes the what so much easier to trust. High above us, way up near the top of the hemisphere, where the jet stream races around the planet like a fast-moving river of air, something called a blocking pattern is forming. That word block is exactly what it sounds like. Under normal conditions, the jet stream flows quickly and fairly directly from west to east, dragging one weather system after another along behind it, so nothing really lingers too long in one place. But every so often, a massive dome of high pressure plants itself down in one spot and simply will not move. It behaves like a boulder dropped straight into the middle of that river. The flow cannot punch through it, so instead it has to bend around it. And when it bends, it carves out these huge, sweeping loops. Inside those loops, cold air that normally stays bottled up in the Arctic suddenly finds a wide open door leading south. What makes this particular setup so unusual is that not one but two of these blocking boulders are forming at nearly the same time. Here is where I want to get specific, because vague talk about a pattern shifting does not tell you anything useful. Forecasters watch a handful of key numbers to know when a shift like this is on the way, and right now several of them are flashing the exact same warning at once. The first is a measurement called the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is essentially a way of tracking the pressure set up hovering over the northern Atlantic near Greenland. When that number swings into negative territory, it tells you high pressure is stacking up over Greenland, and that is the first of our two boulders. The newest data has that number diving negative right around the 24th of this month, and staying pinned there potentially all the way into the opening days of September. That is not some tiny blip you can shrug off. That is a sustained shift, and it is exactly the kind of setup that steers cold air toward the eastern half of the country. The second measurement worth watching is the East Pacific Oscillation, and this one governs what happens up around Alaska. When it turns negative, a ridge of high pressure swells up over Alaska and the northeastern Pacific, and that becomes the second boulder. Here is the part that made meteorologists sit up and take a second look at their screens. Both of these signals are flipping negative at almost the exact same time, in the exact same window, and they are reinforcing each other rather than working against one another. A negative reading near Alaska builds a wall on the western side of the continent. A negative reading near Greenland builds a wall on the eastern side. Put a wall of high pressure on both ends of the country, and the cold air trapped in the buckled jet stream in between has nowhere left to go but straight down into the heart of North America. Now, I want to be completely honest with you, the way I try to be in every single one of these breakdowns, because there is a genuine disagreement happening between the major forecast models right now, and it matters quite a bit. The two heavyweight systems that meteorologists lean on the most are the European model and the American model. Picture them as two extremely experienced ship navigators studying the same storm out on the horizon. Most of the time, they land on the same big picture conclusion, and right now they do agree that a block is forming and that cooler air is heading south. Where they disagree is on how strong that block ultimately gets and how far south the cold air actually reaches. The American model is leaning toward a deeper, more aggressive block, one that would send genuinely cold air plunging much farther down the map than usual. The European model sees the same broad shift but keeps it more restrained, cooler up north, but not diving nearly as dramatically toward the south. That gap between the two is, without question, the single biggest source of uncertainty in this entire forecast, and I will keep coming back to it because how that disagreement gets resolved decides whether the Deep South sees any real relief at all in the coming weeks. There's a third piece I need to bring into this because it is really the engine sitting underneath the whole system. Out in the Pacific Ocean, an El Nino pattern is strengthening, and it is strengthening quickly. Current outlooks put the odds above 90% that this becomes a genuinely strong event heading into the fall and winter months. That matters a great deal, and here is why it ties directly into what is happening above your head right now. El Nino warms up a huge stretch of the tropical Pacific Ocean, and when that ocean warms, it shifts exactly where thunderstorm activity fires off near the equator, which in turn nudges the entire jet stream thousands of miles away into a brand new configuration. It is one of the clearest examples in all of meteorology of how the ocean and the atmosphere are wired together across enormous distances. This warming Pacific is helping tilt the whole system toward exactly the kind of buckled, blocky jet stream pattern we are watching come together right now. So none of this is random noise. There is a driver underneath it, and that driver is only getting stronger by the week. Let me walk you through how this actually plays out day by day, because timing is everything here. For the rest of this week, you're already going to feel the first hints of change creeping in. A cooler push of air is sliding through parts of the country right now, and it is real. But here's the catch that trips a lot of people up watching from home. This first cool shot is not the main event. It is a preview, an appetizer before the real meal. Every single day right behind it, the heat comes surging back in to reclaim the territory it lost. So you might genuinely wake up to a gorgeous, crisp morning and then watch the thermometer climb right back into uncomfortable territory by the afternoon. Across the northern tier, you are looking at highs settling into the 70s where you had been baking through the 90s, which is a real and welcome break, but it comes and goes rather than sticking around. The pattern has not fully locked into place yet. Think of it as a wave pulling back out to sea before it finally breaks onto the shore. The real turn, the one this entire forecast is built around, arrives as we push into the 25th and 26th of the month. That is when the block finally matures. That is when high pressure fully anchors itself up over Alaska and up over Greenland at the same time, and the jet stream carves its deepest trough down into the middle of the country. When that happens, a substantial cold front comes barreling south, and this one is not a preview. This is the wave finally breaking onto the beach. For the Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, and the Northeast, we're talking about temperatures running 10 to 15 degrees below average. And in the coldest pockets of that air mass, potentially 20 degrees below average. Sit with that number for a second. 20 degrees below normal in the final days of August is the kind of anomaly that has people digging jackets out of storage they had already packed away for the season. Overnight lows in the coldest spots could tumble all the way into the 50s. And if the more aggressive American model solution ends up winning out, a few locations could even flirt with the 40s. That is a genuine taste of early autumn showing up while the calendar still insists it is summer. I want to ask you something down in the comments, because it genuinely helps me shape these forecasts around where you actually live. Tell me your city or your general region, and tell me one thing, honestly. Are you the person cheering this cold front on, counting down the days until it finally arrives? Or are you the person who is not ready to let summer go just yet, and would rather the heat stick around a little longer? I read through these comments, and the split is always fascinating, because this exact same pattern is a rescue for some of you, and a genuine disappointment for others depending entirely on where you live. Drop your answer below and let me know which side of that line you fall on. Now here's the twist I promised you at the very start, the part most people watching the news are going to completely miss. While all of that cool air is flooding into the north and the east, that exact same pattern does something almost cruel to the southern half of the country. Remember, when you force a giant block into place and make the jet stream buckle around it, you're not just carving out a cold trough. On the flip side of that buckle, you are also building a ridge, a dome of heat, and this particular pattern is shoving that heat dome directly over the west and the south central states. So at the very moment folks up in the Midwest are pulling sweatshirts out of the closet, folks across Texas, Oklahoma, the deep south, and the desert southwest are getting hammered by relentless, genuinely dangerous heat. This is not some small footnote buried at the bottom of the forecast. Climate outlooks have specifically flagged extreme heat and rapid onset drought building across the southern United States. That means the ground dries out fast, the heat starts feeding on itself, and it becomes a real hazard rather than just an inconvenience you complain about at the water cooler. Picture the whole map for a second like a seesaw. Press down hard on one end and the other end shoots straight up. That is precisely what is unfolding across the continent right now. The same atmospheric setup delivering welcome relief to the north is simultaneously locking a lid of heat down over the south. In the hottest zones across the desert southwest, we are still talking about afternoon highs punching past 110, even 115 degrees. Across the south central states and the southeast, widespread readings over 100 degrees remain on the table. And once you factor in humidity, the heat index, the number that tells you what it actually feels like on your skin, climbs well beyond even that. And drought makes everything worse because dry soil cannot cool itself the way moist ground can. Every scorching day bakes the land a little harder, and that baked land then radiates even more heat back into the atmosphere the next day. It is a feedback loop, and once one of those gets rolling, it is genuinely hard to break. That divide, cool and refreshing up north, blistering and dangerous down south, is really the true story hiding inside this pattern. It is a tale of two Americas separated by a single line drawn across the weather map. And where you happen to live relative to that line decides pretty much everything about your next 2 weeks. The farther that block manages to push the cold front south, the more the country gets to escape the heat entirely. If the American model turns out to be right and the block goes deep, that front could theoretically push all the way toward the Gulf as we roll into September, which would be a genuine shock to the system for places that have not felt a single day of below average temperatures in what feels like forever. If the European model turns out to be right and the block stays more contained, then relief mostly stops short and the South stays locked underneath that heat dome for longer. This is exactly why I keep hammering on the difference between these two models. It is not some minor technical detail. It is the entire ballgame for tens of millions of people. Let me pull back from the big picture pattern for a moment and talk about what is happening right now, because a shift this large never arrives quietly. When cold air on the move starts colliding with warm, humid air that has been sitting in place for weeks, the atmosphere reacts, and that reaction is storms. Over the past couple of days, the collision has already produced rounds of rough weather, and forecasters are flagging more of it as the front continues pushing through. The good news, and I want to be calm and clear about this rather than hype it up for views, is that this is not shaping up to be a major tornado situation. The primary threat with these storms is damaging wind along with large hail, and I want to explain exactly why. Because understanding the reasoning behind a warning keeps you safer than simply hearing the warning itself. For the middle of this week, forecasters have outlined an elevated risk of severe storms stretching across the Central Plains, the lower Missouri Valley, and the upper Midwest. In plain language, that means scattered strong storms are likely, and some of them will cross the line into severe territory. The setup involves what meteorologists call steep lapse rates, which is really just a fancy way of saying the air cools off very quickly as you climb higher into the atmosphere. That kind of profile acts almost like a ramp for rising air, letting thunderstorms build tall and powerful in a short amount of time. Layer in a boost of wind higher up in the atmosphere as an overnight low-level jet cranks up, and you get storms capable of organizing into clusters that produce damaging wind gusts as they race across the landscape. Forecasters have been highlighting the potential for gusts strong enough to snap tree branches, knock down power lines, and cause the kind of scattered outages that can leave neighborhoods sitting in the dark for hours at a time. There is also a genuine hail threat, with some storms capable of dropping stones large enough to dent cars and damage roofs, and the most intense cells potentially exceeding 2 inches across. Geographically, keep your eye on the northern Rockies and the central high plains, where a small ripple of energy in the upper atmosphere, what meteorologists call a short wave, dives southeast and touches off storms. Watch the upper Midwest across Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where storms fire ahead of the advancing front and may begin as isolated supercells capable of large hail before collapsing into a line and turning into more of a wind threat by evening. Keep an eye on the Central Plains and lower Missouri Valley, too, where storms are expected to cluster together and grow upscale into an organized system carrying real damaging wind potential as it sweeps toward Missouri. Down across Mississippi, Alabama, and into northern Florida, a very moist and unstable air mass supports storms as well, though the wind shear there is weaker, so those tend to be more of the pulse and collapse variety that can still pack a serious downburst punch. Looking one additional day ahead, the severe threat shifts and reorganizes around the Ozark Plateau and into the Mid-South, with 1 or 2 clusters of storms capable of producing swaths of damaging wind. There is even a mention of central and southeastern Arizona getting drawn into the action as monsoon moisture interacts with the terrain. The tornado risk across all of these days remains low, generally sitting in the marginal to isolated category rather than anything widespread. If a brief spin-up storm does occur, it would most likely be quick and short-lived rather than one of the long track systems you tend to see during the peak of spring. Then, heading into Thursday, the main action nudges into the northern plains, from Minnesota into Nebraska and northern Kansas, with large hail as the headline threat thanks to that same combination of strong, sheer, steep lapse rates and just enough available moisture. A separate, smaller threat for locally damaging gusts sets up from eastern Virginia into the Carolinas as a wave crosses over the Appalachians. I want to leave you with something practical here because a forecast is only useful if it actually changes what you do. When storms like these are moving through your area, the single most important thing you can have is a reliable way to receive warnings even while you are asleep. A weather radio or the emergency alerts built into your phone can wake you up the moment a warning is issued for your exact location. Damaging wind and large hail do not need a tornado attached to them to be dangerous. A 70-mile-an-hour gust can bring a tree down onto a house just as easily as it can knock the power out for an entire town. So take these seriously. Bring in anything loose sitting out in your yard. Park your car under cover if you have the option. and know ahead of time where the sturdiest interior room in your home is. It costs you nothing to be prepared, and it can end up saving you a great deal. Let me tie the storms back into the bigger picture, because they are not really a separate story at all. They are the sound of the pattern changing in real time. Every one of these fronts marks a boundary between the old air mass and the new one, between the summer heat that is fighting to hang on and the cooler regime trying to take its place. As the block matures over the coming week, an upper-level ridge is forecast to expand from the Four Corners region into the southern plains, while the flow aloft over the northern plains bends and shifts east across the Midwest and into the Northeast. That is the signature of the entire system finally coming together. The storms rolling through this week are essentially the friction created by that transition. Once the block fully locks into place and the big cool anomaly settles down over the northern and eastern states toward the end of the month, the atmosphere calms considerably in those regions, because the sharp temperature contrast that fuels storm activity has moved south along with the front. Let me talk about the tropics for just a moment, because you may have heard some chatter about a system out in the Atlantic, and I want to give you the honest, grounded read rather than a scary headline. There is the possibility of a tropical wave rolling off the African coast and attempting to develop out in the Atlantic. But the odds of it becoming something significant that actually threatens land are low right now, and here is the fascinating part. This exact same pattern we have spent the last several minutes discussing is part of the reason why. Remember that strengthening El Nino I mentioned earlier. One of the things a strong El Nino reliably does is crank up wind shear across the Atlantic basin. Wind shear happens when winds are blowing at different speeds in different directions at different heights, and it is absolutely brutal for a young tropical system trying to get organized. It rips the storm apart before it has a chance to consolidate, tilting and shredding the tall thunderstorms a hurricane needs in order to survive and strengthen. On top of that, if the block manages to push a cold front far enough out over the ocean, it can inject dry, stable air along with even more shear, right into the path of any developing wave, effectively pushing it away and keeping it weak. So while the tropics are never something to completely ignore during hurricane season, the atmospheric deck is currently stacked against major development, and that happens to be a direct consequence of the very same forces reshaping your local forecast. Here's a second question I would love for you to weigh in on down in the comments, because this one is about trust rather than temperature. When two of the world's best forecast models disagree the way the American and European models are disagreeing right now, which one do you personally find yourself leaning toward believing, and why? Some of you follow this stuff closely enough that you have your own opinion on which model has been performing better lately. Others of you just want the bottom line without wading into the technical argument. Tell me how you personally handle a forecast when the experts themselves are split, because that tension between certainty and honesty is really at the heart of what makes this whole field so difficult and so interesting to follow. Let me get concrete now about the actual temperatures you can expect, because this is what most of you tuned in for. Highs across the central and northern parts of the country settle into the 70s and 80s, which for a lot of you is a genuinely welcome step down from where things have been. But push into the central and southern states, and you are still looking at readings well over 100 degrees, with the southeast sitting in the high 90s to around 100, and the desert southwest still cooking somewhere past 110 to 115 degrees. Remember, those numbers are the raw air temperature. The heat index, the feels like number, runs even higher once humidity gets factored in, which is exactly why forecasters are treating extreme heat as a genuine hazard rather than just an everyday discomfort. As the days tick by, each cold front that swings through knocks the northern temperatures down another notch, but the heat keeps trying to rebuild right behind it, so it becomes a rhythm. Cool, then warm again, cool, then warm again, right up until the big block finally slams the door shut. That final moment, the deepest cool shot of the entire pattern, is really the payoff of this whole forecast, and it lands as we move from next Tuesday and Wednesday into the very final days of the month. That is when the coolest air arrives, deeper and colder than the appetizer shots we're getting this week, with the Midwest, the Great Lakes, and the Northeast potentially running 10 to 20 degrees below average. Overnight lows slide into the 50s, and in the coldest scenarios, into the 40s in a handful of spots. When forecasters compare the shorter range models against the longer range guidance, there is agreement that cooler air is on the way, though the longer range guidance is a touch less aggressive about exactly how deep it dives. That is the same American versus European tension showing up again in a slightly different form. The overall trend, though, the direction everything is leaning, favors the colder outcome for the northern tier, and possibly a push of that cool air farther south than we have seen in quite a long time if the stronger block ends up verifying. So who ends up where once the dust settles? A large chunk of the northern and central country lands comfortably in the 50s and 60s for overnight lows, with pleasant days that finally feel like the turning of the season. The zone that had been stuck in the 90s drops down into the 70s. The zone that had been baking in triple digits may ease into the 80s, but the far south and the desert southwest, sitting directly under that ridge, stay hot, and if any relief reaches them at all, it arrives late and it arrives modest. Then, as we move into the first third of September, the guidance hints that the cold front pushes even deeper, which would extend and expand that relief even further. That is the optimistic branch of this forecast, and I will be watching it closely because if it holds, it means a genuine, lasting break for a much larger share of the country. Let me step back now and put the whole thing together into one clear picture, because I promised you at the start that you would understand this better than the headlines by the time we finished. Here it is in a single breath. A rare double block is forming. One dome of high pressure anchoring near Alaska and another near Greenland, pushed into place partly by a rapidly strengthening El Nino out in the Pacific. The double block buckles the jet stream, carving a deep trough down the middle of the country that floods the north and the east with unusually cool air for late August, while at the very same time building a heat ridge that traps dangerous, drought-feeding heat over the south and the desert southwest. The clash between the incoming cool air and the lingering summer warmth fires off rounds of storms, mostly wind and hail driven rather than tornado driven, as the whole pattern rearranges itself. And the single biggest question left hanging over all of it is how far south that cold front ultimately manages to push, a question the American and European models are actively arguing over right now, with the deeper, more dramatic solution favored by the American model and the more restrained solution held by the European model. The reason I feel confident telling you relief is genuinely coming is that the driving signals behind it, the negative North Atlantic oscillation, the negative East Pacific oscillation, and the strengthening El Nino, are all pointing in the same direction at the same time, and that kind of agreement is what gives a forecast its backbone. The reason I'm not going to pretend I know the exact temperature in your backyard on the last day of the month is that the depth of the block is still being sorted out, and this is weather, which means it will wobble and shift a little between now and then. What I can promise you is that I will keep tracking every new model run, every update to these key signals, and I will tell you the truth as it evolves, whether that truth ends up being the cold plunging farther than we hoped, or the block backing off sooner than we wanted. If you have made it this far, you now understand a pattern that is about to define the next 2 weeks of weather for tens of millions of people, and you understand it not as some vague headline, but as an actual machine. Gears turning all the way from the Pacific Ocean to the top of Greenland to the front porch outside your own door. That is really the whole point of this channel. Not to scare you, not to hype you up for clicks, but to hand you the real picture so you can plan your life, protect your family, and actually understand what is coming and why it is coming. The heat that has felt like it would never let go is finally meeting its match, and the door to autumn is cracking open earlier than expected across a big piece of this country. So here is what I am asking of you. If this made the forecast clearer for you, hit that like button, because it genuinely helps more people find honest weather coverage instead of clickbait. Share this with someone you know who has been miserable in the heat because relief is on the way and they deserve to hear about it. And if you're not already part of this channel, go ahead and subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because this pattern is moving fast, the models are updating constantly, and I will be here breaking down every twist the moment it happens. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and whether you are ready for the cool down or dreading it. I will see you in the next one. Stay safe, keep an eye on the sky when those storms roll through, and remember, the atmosphere just made its move.